Yuba Sokona, who is one of the 3 vice chairs of the IPCC and is the report champion for this report. Then Hans Otto Pertner, co-chair of Working Group 2, which deals with impacts, adaptation and vulnerability of climate change. Then Eduardo Calvo Buendia, co-chair of the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories. Deborah Roberts, the other co-chair of Working Group 2. Kyoto Tanabe, the other co-chair of the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories. And Kyoto may have to leave early for another appointment. So some of you may be following this press conference remotely. It's available on facebook.com/IPCC. And we will be taking questions after the initial presentation. We'll be taking questions both from the floor in here and remotely through the application Slido. So if you're following this press conference remotely, go to sli.do, Slido, on the web, and then you choose the event code SRCCL, which is the abbreviation and hashtag for this report, SRCCL. You can submit questions that way, and if you do submit questions remotely, please make sure you give your name. So with that, I will hand over to Yuba Sokona, Vice Chair of the IPCC, to kick off the presentation.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us. The IPCC decided at its 43rd session in Nairobi, Kenya, in April 2016, to prepare this special report after member states and observer organizations were asked to submit views on potential theme for special report during the current 6th assessment report cycle. 9 clusters were considered on different themes, including land, cities, and oceans. The special report on climate change and land represents the 2nd largest cluster and covers 7 proposals from member states and observer organizations that are related to land. Over 2 years in the making, the special report on climate change and land explores how the way we use our land contributes to climate change and how climate change affects our land. This special report was prepared by 107 lead earth scientists from 52 countries across the regions of the world, who acted as coordinating lead authors, and review editors. 40% of the coordinating lead authors are female. 52% of the authors are from developing countries, making this the 3rd IPCC report to have more authors from developing countries than developed countries. Over 7,000 scientific publications were assessed in this report. The report received a total of 28,000 comments from experts, reviewers, and government. We'll hand over to the chair, Dr. Ho-Soon Lee.
Thank you, Yuba Sokona, Vice Chair of IPCC, and thank you. Today I'd like to turn to your attention to the cover for the special report on climate change and land. You will notice that it matches other special report we produce in this assessment cycle. For this photograph, this one was sourced from photographer Jan Yatos Bertrand. This was taken in Turkey, and this striking image shows land from above. This is very important in the context of this special report, as this image represents a mixture of terrain and purposes that land has on our diverse planet. As Yuba Sokona, Vice Chair of IPCC, just told us a few minutes ago that the governments, our member governments, 195 governments, and challenged IPCC to take the first ever comprehensive look at the whole land climate system. And this is the result. We have received approval and acceptance by our member government yesterday. Before handing over to this report, the major two co-chairs, I'd like to present the high-level findings of this report. That is, land is where we live. Land is under growing human pressure, and land is part of the solution, but land cannot do it all. Valerie?
Thank you, Ho-sung. Population growth and changes in consumption of food, feed, fiber, timber, and energy have caused unprecedented rates of land and freshwater use. We, humans, affect more than 70% of ice-free land. A quarter of this land is degraded. The way we produce food and what we eat contributes to the loss of natural ecosystems and declining biodiversity. When land is degraded, it reduces the soil's ability to take up carbon, and this exacerbates climate change. In turn, climate change exacerbates land degradation in many different ways. Today, 500 million people live in areas that experience desertification. People living in already degraded or desertified areas are increasingly negatively affected by climate change. Our next findings will now be reported by my fellow co-chair, Pan Maujai.
Thank you, Valerie. The temperature over the land surface have increased almost twice the global average. Climate zones are shifting. Many extreme events, such as heat wave, drought, and heavy precipitation, are becoming more frequent and intense. Increasing impacts on land are projected in the future as a result of water scarcity, wildfire, and permafrost thawing. In a warmer climate, the capacity of the land to store the carbon may be reduced. Despite increasing food production, an estimated 821 million people are undernourished. In cold regions, yields may temporarily benefit from warmer climate conditions. In general, climate change will cause declined yields, increased prices, reduced nutrition levels, and disruption in supply chains for food. Now I would like to hand over to my fellow co-chair, Eduardo Calvo.
Thank you, Bang Mao. Agriculture, forestry, and other types of land use account for 23% of human greenhouse gas emissions. Deforestation, peatland burning, and wood harvest directly contribute around 13% of human-caused carbon dioxide emissions. The food system as a whole, which includes food production and processing, transport, retail consumption, loss, and waste, is currently responsible for up to a third of our global greenhouse gas emissions. And I will like to give the floor to my fellow co-chair, Jim.
Okay, thanks, Eduardo. So improving the way that we use land and produce food does have an important part to play in helping us to tackle climate change. Limiting global warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees will involve removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and land has a critical role to play in carbon dioxide removal. Agricultural practices can help build up carbon in soils, but it could also mean using more bioenergy, with or without carbon capture and storage, and expanding forests. 25 to 30% of food produced is lost or wasted, and reducing food loss and waste can reduce pressure on land, improve food security, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, a move to more balanced diets could help us adapt to and limit climate change. Some diets require more land and water and lead to higher emissions than others. For example, diets that are high in grains, nuts and vegetables have a lower carbon footprint than those that are high in meat, and they lead to better health outcomes. But of course, dietary choices are influenced by local production practices and cultural habits. And with that, I'll pass over to my friend Shukla.
Thank you, Jim. But there are things we can do to both tackle land degradation and prevent or adapt to further climate change. Vegetation and soils absorb 1/3 of carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels and industry. Sustainable land management can improve the amount of emissions that soils and vegetation absorb and sometimes reverse the adverse impacts of climate change. Diverse agricultural systems reduce both the economic and environmental risks related to land degradation. There are ways to prevent vulnerabilities that come from the negative impacts that climate can have on our land and food. I now hand over to Hans.
Thank you very much, Shukla. We are best placed to tackle climate change in a world with an overall focus on sustainability. This means low population growth and reduced inequalities, improved nutrition, and lower food waste. Early action to reduce emissions means less land needed for bioenergy or for afforestation. Policies outside of land are therefore important and can make a critical difference, for example, concerning energy, transport, and the environment. There are things we are already doing that can be scaled up or used elsewhere. The food system has the potential to adapt to climate change and avoid additional risks by diversifying. There are ways to manage land and reduce risks for ecosystems and people, and clearly, early action is the most cost-effective. Climate change creates additional stresses on land, exacerbating existing risks to livelihoods, ecosystems, species, and biodiversity. Near-term actions to promote sustainable land management will help reduce the loss of biodiversity also through restoring natural ecosystems and their capacity to store carbon. Indigenous and local knowledge can contribute to overcoming the combined challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, food security, desertification, and land degradation. And with that, I hand over to my fellow co-chair, Deborah Roberts.
Thanks so much, Hans. Drivers of land use decisions come from both the regional and international pressures. Regional cooperation is therefore vital. Trade in food can be an important way to relieve local risks to food security and from climate change impact. Some regions, countries, and communities have a limited capacity to deal with the negative impacts of climate change. Therefore, the right mix of policies make all the difference if we are to achieve sustainable development. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors is essential if we want to keep below 2 degrees Celsius. There are, however, limits to the scale of energy crops and afforestation that could be used to achieve this goal. It also takes time for trees and soils to store carbon effectively. Better land management can release agricultural land for afforestation and bioenergy so as not to impact on food security. Careful management of bioenergy will also avoid risks to food security, biodiversity, and land degradation. So let me repeat the 3 messages our chairs stressed at the beginning of this presentation. Land is under growing human pressure. Land is part of the solution, but land cannot do it all. And now I hand back to Jonathan Lind to supervise the Q&A session.
Thank you, Deborah. And the fact that we have so many people on the podium today presenting this report is because this is only the second special report that the IPCC has prepared with all three of the IPCC working groups, and it's the first one that we've done with all three working groups and the cooperation of the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories. And what that signifies is it shows how the work we're doing at the moment is highly integrated across different disciplines and sectors. So with that, we'll move on to the Q&A. And if you're in the room and want to ask a question, please raise your hand. And if you're selected, you need to press the little button with a speaking mouth and waves coming out of it. And please then say who you are, what medium you represent, and who you would like to direct your question to, if any, or generally. If you're following this remotely, you can submit questions through Slido, so going online, sli.do, and entering the event code SRCCL, short for Special Report on Climate Change and Land, and please give your name when you submit a question. So any questions in the room now? Gentleman there.
Hi. Hello? Hi, Patrick Gailey from AFP News Agency. This is a question for anyone on the panel who may have some insight. The final summary for policymakers yesterday, the one that arrived last night, is a fair bit longer than the one that you guys arrived with. There's also quite a lot of paragraphs with low to medium confidence. I just wondered if you could outline a little bit of what was added and why there may be so many things with low or medium confidence in the summary for policymakers. And do you fear that that may water down its message?
Thanks. And Jim, would you like to start off with that?
Yeah, in terms of why the summary for policymakers lengthened slightly, the characteristics of this report, you can tell by the long title, just the huge scope of the report. And one of the overarching messages we would have from it is that many of the solutions in the land sector are very regionally and locally specific. And as we sat in this room for 5 days with countries from all parts of the world, of course, everybody wanted an appropriate reference to their particular problem that they were facing. So you can see in there that there are many, many sort of lists included in the points. And that really reflects the discussions that we had. We had to identify which were the most important parts to pick out and pull it there. The other thing is, I think with this report being very interdisciplinary, which Jonathan mentioned, it meant that there were many scientific communities involved in the report. You will also note that there are quite a lot of footnotes with definitions in them. And it was only through the use of these painfully discussed footnotes that we were able to get that communication between the different scientific communities. So I think that's the explanation for your first question. And I think IPCC reports have always had medium confidence in them. We have always been required in producing these confidence levels to take careful consideration about the amount of literature that's out there. So if there isn't a huge literature, if it's a sort of medium size, we will come up with medium confidence. And frankly, it reflects an honest appraisal of the literature that we had to assess, given the guidance that we've given to ourselves on how to grade these confidence levels.
Thanks, Valerie.
I just wanted to stress the fact that the approval session showed how much government delegates cared for every aspect of the underlying chapters. So they asked to provide more details, bringing scientific information that was present in the underlying chapters. And also they asked to add 2 bullet points related to cities, which are important for many people in this planet.
Thanks. I have a couple of questions from outside, so I'll take Uma Irfan of Vox. And the new report doesn't look at urban ecosystem dynamics in detail, but it does note that urbanization can exacerbate warming and diminish cropland. Could the authors elaborate on how the growth of cities and urbanization is expected to impact climate and food security, and how we can mitigate harm? And I think Deborah might want to look at that.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. As Valerie indicated, the representatives of the countries who gathered in this room over the last week or so considered all aspects of land and raised very vociferously that one of the big megatrends of the century is urbanization. And that's the reason that we see an additional bullet point coming forward, really looking at the interaction between that megatrend and the use of land for productive uses such as food security and so on. There's also an existing bullet point which refers to the fact that climate change will exacerbate warming trends that already exist in cities because of the way that we build them. The reason that cities are not covered fully in this report is it's anticipated that we will have a special report on cities in the 7th assessment cycle, and the important building block towards that major product is in fact the main assessment report. So if we look at working group 1, 2 and 3, there's a much more heightened focus on cities in the main assessment reports, which will call out the relationship between urban, climate change and sustainable development in more detail.
Thanks. Questions in the room? Gentleman there.
Laurent Siro, Swiss News Agency. Question to anyone on the panel who would like to answer. So you recommend a change in diets. Some NGOs say we should reduce the consumption of meat up to 50%. I was wondering whether you have a threshold, a similar threshold that make consensus now in that regard. And maybe a quick question to Chairman Husung Lee. The next meeting where the states are supposed to come with policy announcement at 2020, but there will be that summit in New York in September. Do you think that the member states can afford to delay the announcement in 2020, or should they come to New York already with some announcements?
Maybe Jim wants to start on the diet question.
Yeah, just on the diets, I should absolutely emphasise that IPCC does not recommend people's diets. That is very clear. The words are chosen very carefully. What we've pointed out on the basis of the scientific evidence is that there are certain types of diets that have a lower carbon footprint and put less pressure on land. Obviously, in the summary for policymakers, that's done at a very high level. If you go down into the underlying chapters of the report, you will find much more detail on the greenhouse gas footprints of individual types of diet. But we were very careful in our introduction to spell out that dietary choices are very often shaped or influenced by local production practices and factors and cultural habits. And I think, given IPCC's remit, we don't do recommendations, we produce the evidence for the policymakers. We've been very careful to stick to that side of the line.
Regarding the policy use of this report, I want to report to you that this report will be conveyed to the major findings of this report will be conveyed to the UN Convention to combat the desertification, the COP14 that will be held in September in New Delhi, as well as to the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit that will be held in New York, September.
Thank you. More questions? Yeah, over there, please.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Great. Thanks very much. Apologies for that. David Shuckman, BBC News. Just to follow up the question about diet, I understand what you're saying, that you're not recommending what people should do. Given the science that you lay out about the impacts, potentially the benefits of moving to more of a plant-based diet, I'm wondering whether the panel has given up meat or is reducing its own consumption of meat.
Who would like to talk about maybe, well, Jim, and then perhaps